Welcome to this Tax Justice Network podcast, looking at some of the findings of the 2020 Financial Secrecy Index and its relevance for Africa. I'm Naomi Fowler from the Tax Justice Network's monthly podcast, the Taxcast. I'm going to speak to the Tax Justice Network's Rachel Etter-Phoya in Malawi, John Christensen in the United Kingdom, and Idriss Linge in Cameroon. He's a finance journalist and the producer of the Tax Justice Network's Francophone podcast, Impots et Justice Sociale. Secrecy levels in Africa are a problem, but African countries aren't among the world's worst offenders, right? What does the Financial Secrecy Index say about the relationship between Africa and the world's wealthiest countries?
Secrecy in Africa is a problem, but it's hypocritical and convenient for former colonial and neo-colonial powers to so often blame challenges in developing and African countries on so-called poor governance, rather than to consider their own acts of exploitation. I mean, the rich OECD countries are responsible for nearly half of global secrecy in this year's Financial Secrecy Index. They profit greatly from the provision of financial services. In fact, the UK's levels of secrecy have increased more than any other country between 2018 and 2020, while African countries have shown leadership in improving transparency in the last couple of years.
We know that many countries on the continent post a poor performance. This is the case for financial transparency, accessibility to the registry, and many other indicators that are being appraised by the Financial Secrecy Index, where African countries do not really perform well. What we can see is countries in Europe or United States are really worst ranked. And this means that maybe Africa is not the home of financial secrecy, but is the departing point of all those illicit financial flows.
Let's look at some of that leadership in Africa. Ghana is the most transparent in the region of the countries that have been assessed, with a secrecy score 5 points lower than the second biggest player, which is South Africa. So what's Ghana doing there?
Ghana in particular has taken a lead in the region in addressing financial secrecy. So one of the problems facing African countries is that often the real people behind the companies and trusts and other entities are not known to the authorities or the public. So in this way, a public procurement process for all important medical supplies for hospitals, school textbooks, road building can look legitimate with 10 different companies putting in bids. But if one were perhaps to take away the veil of secrecy, all companies might be shown to be owned by the same elite politically connected family, and all the bids might be inflated. So on paper everything looks fine, but on closer examination, if there's more access to information around the beneficial owners, it would reveal the collusion at work to drain public resources. So to address challenges like this, the public disclosure of beneficial owners is needed. And in 2016, Ghana amended its companies law to take action in this area. It now requires a registration of beneficial ownership for companies, including the name, address and birth dates of individuals, the real owners behind the companies, not just the legal directors. And we're expecting to see the launch of a public online accessible registry of beneficial owners this year, which means investors, activists, journalists, government officials will all be able to easily access the data and work together to improve compliance and stem the flow of corrupt money. South Africa has a low secrecy score in the region, yet given it is a much bigger player than Ghana, it is more responsible for the damage from financial and legal secrecy. South Africa would do well by increasing transparency requirements for company reporting, such as ensuring companies make accounts public, and also to require country-by-country reporting for South African multinationals and the local filing of country-by-country reports by multinationals, including the many mining companies operating in South Africa. Why is this important? These reports would show a breakdown of the financial results and payments to government by companies that are operating around the world and in South Africa, and give the South African government and other governments in the region where South African multinationals are working a better idea of if they are collecting their fair share of tax.
Which country is the biggest threat in the region, and why?
Kenya is the biggest threat in the region. It has aspirations to set up an international financial centre in Nairobi, modelled on the City of London. This could further increase illicit financial flows leaving the continent. Kenya is also pursuing at the same time a path to expand its double tax treaty network, such as recently signing an agreement with Mauritius. It's signed already 15 agreements and has 15 agreements currently in the works at negotiation or ratification stage. So in this way, multinationals may be able to reduce their taxes in countries in the region or beyond where they're actually doing business, employing workers and extracting resources, for example, and instead siphon off the money to low or no tax jurisdictions, which Nairobi International Financial Centre may be setting itself up to be.
Yes, that's worrying. The Financial Secrecy Index shows as well that Africa is lagging behind in requiring legal and beneficial ownership transparency for entities registered within their borders. What does that mean is actually happening on the ground? Why does it matter? I mean, the Tax Justice Network speaks always about the essential pillars of tax justice, the ABCs.
At home across the continent, improving in the ABCs of tax justice will go a long way to stem illicit financial flows. The automatic exchange of information, beneficial ownership disclosure, and country-by-country reporting. At the moment, only 6 of the 17 African countries included in this edition of the Financial Secrecy Index have been able to sign the Multilateral Competent Authority Agreement to facilitate the automatic exchange of information. More countries need to sign up. Requiring companies, trusts and all legal entities to register the real people behind the companies and setting up public beneficial ownership registries that are easily accessible are also key to addressing money laundering and corruption. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, introducing country-by-country reporting requirements for multinationals headquartered within African countries' borders and requiring multinationals, of which there are many operating in African countries, to file local country-by-country reports to stem this tide of money that leaves the continent at the expense of citizens and governments.
Angola has the highest secrecy score of all 17 African countries included in the Financial Secrecy Index 2020, just ahead of Algeria and Liberia. And Angola is taking action to stop other Luanda leaks type scandals, and it's asking for help from Portugal, Dubai and other countries to recover state funds of more than $1 billion. What can African countries do to stop exposing their citizens to unnecessary risks?
It's telling in the wake of the Luanda leaks that Angola has the highest secrecy score of all 17 African countries included in the 2020 edition of the Financial Secrecy Index. But the biggest story behind the Luanda leaks is how many secrecy jurisdictions were involved, all over the world, including countries supposedly perceived to be among the less corrupt, like Hong Kong or Mauritius. The International Consortium for Investigative Journalists and 36 media partners uncovered how former Angolan president's daughter Isabel dos Santos brought state assets and made use of more than 400 companies, subsidiaries and accounts in 94 secrecy jurisdictions. This business empire benefited to the tune of many billions of dollars in consulting jobs, loans, public work contracts and licenses from the Angolan government. These leaks again expose the hypocrisy that lies behind some of the finger-pointing at so-called highly corrupt developing countries and provides a basis for a new way of understanding about corruption in a global context.
If we look at a scandal like Luanda leaks, when you look at the countries that facilitated that type of extraction of wealth from Angola by the former president's daughter, a lot of those countries are the ones that might score quite well in the Financial Secrecy Index, and really we're looking at countries that have supposedly strong anti-money laundering rules, know your customer rules and all the rest of it, and yet that was where a lot of the money was washed through.
Yep, that's a fair point. And for all of the progress that's been made between state agencies, cooperating better on information exchange, there remains a gigantic compliance problem. And that problem runs right the way through what we call the enabler industry, from the bankers to the lawyers, the trust administrators, through to estate agents. And since most of these enablers are based in the global north, this is a story about corrupt professionals in Europe and North America. So what the Isabel dos Santos story reveals is one compliance failure after another, going back many, many years, especially important because her father was, of course, the president of a major oil exporting state and therefore a very prominent politically exposed person. So frankly, every single red flag in the compliance toolkit should have been flying at the very top of the mast, and clearly wasn't. But this is, of course, a story involving billions of dollars, and when bankers see a client with billions, they seem to drop any pretense of complying with laws and tricksy little things like know your client rules and suspicious transaction reporting. And I think this is, above all, a sign of the failure of the financial professionals across the world. These compliance failures are systemic, they're global, and my sense is this problem isn't going to be going away until really serious sanctions are applied against the enabler community. Bankers and lawyers just don't like going to jail, which is exactly where some of them belong. And if custodial sentences were applied, the message would quickly get out to these financial professionals that the game is over. Tackling the enablers is the next big step for the tax justice community. Bankers and lawyers still seem to think they can get away with it, so we need to strip away this sense of immunity.
Thanks for listening. You can read more on the methodology and results, along with plenty of other data, on www.financialsecrecyindex.com.